Hey legends, and welcome back to the most speculative sim racing channel. Today, we're going to engage in the age-old sim racing pastime of taking a simple financial report which hints at a product being in development and then extrapolating that to mean all sorts of things it actually doesn't, all the while appending all the hopes and dreams we've ever had for sim racing onto a small, passionate development team who likely have no hope of ever living up to them, thus setting ourselves up for yet another development cycle full of the same complaints and circular arguments we've had for the last 2 decades. But we're gonna do it in fun spirit and style. Sarcasm aside, Assetto Corsa is one of the most successful sim racing titles ever developed, and is a testament to the strength of open platforms with strong community support. Those who have followed this channel over the last year have likely borne witness to my gradual warming to its semi-kinda offshoot sequel, Assetto Corsa Competizione. While the original AC never really tugged at my heartstrings, watching the developers chip away at ACC as it went from a borderline undrivable tank simulator in early access to arguably the premier GT car simulation platform in sim racing was impressive to say the least. As someone that started multiple businesses in their life, I have a tremendous amount of respect for hard work, dedication, and incremental progress. Pretty much the words that encapsulate ACC's development process. This video is my chance to read between the lines, hypothesize, and romanticize about what may be to come in AC2. Without a doubt, the single greatest argument that's levied against ACC is, "But it only simulates GT3 cars!" Negating the fact that specialization is one of ACC's greatest strengths, it's pretty obvious when going off recent interviews with Marco Massaruto that one of the biggest things the team feel is lacking from that simulation are road cars. There is a certain joy in simulating cars attainable to the average person, or perhaps slightly wealthier than average person, because it creates a sense of connection with the driving experience that's immediately more relatable. The more pronounced sense of weight transfer, the less aggressive aero profile, the ability to feel what a perfectly laser-scanned classic racing circuit on the other side of the globe might actually feel like from a reference point you personally understand. While this is of course all speculation, I think one of the safest bets we can make is that AC2 is likely to come out with a strong roster of road cars, even if they may specialize a little toward the super and hypercar end of the scale. One of the biggest topics of conversation in the Kunos sphere has been whether the jump to Unreal Engine 4 was actually a good idea versus using their own in-house engine. Reading between the lines of recent interviews, it appears that they're still internally trying to make that decision, but potentially leaning toward going back toward an in-house engine, free of some of the intrinsic restraints of UE4, which come AC2 would surely at least be UE5. Anything is possible at this point, but one of the major features the community have asked for, such as an advanced real-road system similar to that of rFactor 2, is, according to the devs at least, apparently impossible in UE4. Other notable omissions which simplify the driving experience is the fact that we don't need to worry about undercarriage damage on the cars, so one is free to hit curbs as aggressively as they dare during hot laps. That aside, there is a far more pragmatic concern, namely that in many ways the original Assetto Corsa engine, spruced up with the amazing work done with custom shaders patch and Soul, now under some circumstances looks comparable to ACC, and in others, such as the visual rendering of wet weather, far better, all the while somehow managing to run more efficiently on most computers. The graphics and performance never quite hit their stride in ACC, with lots of noticeable artifacting with aliasing, texture pop-in, and strange flat surface lack of texturing on some of the car finishes. Then comes the VR performance. The original AC is notoriously one of the best sim racing titles in VR, while ACC is notoriously one of the worst. These are all considerations worth bearing in mind for a potential sequel. If Kunos are wise enough to hire the teams behind CSP and Soul, even just as part-time contractors, they would be able to eclipse their efforts in ACC by miles. While we could naturally expect the AC2 engine to continue on from the physics framework built up in ACC, here's where I'm going to get super speculative and hopeful. I've now introduced quite a few complete newcomers to sim racing. I've gotten to experience their first steps as an onlooker, free of my own biases. I've set them up with an array of simulators and seen their first impressions as complete laymen driving on a well-dialed-in, fairly high-end sim rig. While they often find the driving experience in ACC compelling, It's only when they're introduced to BeamNG that they say, this finally makes sense. While Kunos have done a tremendous job in dialing in a standard empirical model to drive about as well as one could expect, there is still some X factor missing from the driving experience. I say this while I happily main ACC for the majority of my simulated driving. There is something simply transformative about a well dialed in physical model. You notice this every time you make the shift from ACC to BeamNG. The sensation of weight transfer and progressive nature of grip loss can't be compared. Similar sentiments can be shared using the high quality content of rFactor 2. Despite the known flaws in its physics model, there is still something fundamentally indescribable about how the tyres convey the road sensation through the virtual wheel. It took the 5-point tyre update to make the GT3 cars behave even remotely lifelike over geometrically complex curbs. My hope now, as it always has been, is that Kunos begin to experiment with physical modelling in their approach. While this is known to be the harder path, given my own experiences and those of the growing number of people I've introduced to sim racing, there's an aspect to it which seems capable of capturing more emergent nuances of car behaviour and thus creating a greater sense of engagement and joy for the driver. I say this knowing that whenever I've introduced a friend to BeamNG, they rarely ever ask that I boot up AC or ACC in its stead again. While it's strange to compare a car sandbox based entirely around the principle of physical modelling to a title focusing on competitive track racing, it's important to stay open to all fields where relevant developments are made. The recent developments to BeamNG's code have made it feel truly revolutionary in a way where weight transfer, flex, and grip loss no longer feel like canned equations triggering when set conditions are met, but rather something completely interwoven and inseparable from the driving experience itself. Contrary to many others who talk about lack of car and track diversity, the primary drawback for me about AC and ACC has always been the feeling of the driving itself. rFactor 2 is still only one solid physics update away from snatching that crown back, and it will be good to see AC start to box in the same realm as the other titles, running at the very least physically modelled tyres. One of the biggest omissions from ACC is open mod support. There are two schools of thought here, and while I'm one of the ones that believes a hyper-focused title such as ACC shouldn't need to be open for modding, I do understand its utility in more open platform titles, which don't have to worry as much about maintaining their integrity and image because of limiting real-life series licenses. It seems fair to assume that AC2 will go back to its roots as an open platform, especially given how much utility and longevity the modding community has given to the original. It would be a tremendous oversight from the developers to lock out the many talented modders in the community from expanding on the title. That said, AC is notoriously subject to many unlicensed, illegal, and often poor quality portings of cars and tracks from other sims. While this is not Kunos' doing in any way, there is still indemnity to consider, and it's possible that they could be held liable by a very litigious party if this were to start occurring en masse on the sequel. Modding is always a double-edged sword for a game. While it can allow the community to flourish, thrive, and extend the longevity of a title immensely, it can also tarnish the image of the core product, as you immediately start introducing a ton of variability into the quality of content on offer. One of the notable omissions from hardcore sim racing over the last decade has been the decided lack of any real single-player career or meaningful progression mode. I've heard this complaint made not only by other sim racing YouTubers, but also sim racing project managers from behind the scenes who lament the loss of the actual game aspect to sim racing. While there are those heavily on the spectrum like myself, who only care about how lifelike the behavior of cars in a sim is, to the exclusion of almost all else, there are far more people out there interested in the actual gameplay experience. They want to feel immersed in the role of a race car driver, taking their first steps out into the big leagues, courting sponsorships, team attention, and career progression over a span of time. Let's face it, not everybody wants to have sweaty races online, compete in hyper-serious leagues, or try to be an esports professional. Heck, it's fair to say that the vast majority don't fall into any of those categories. If sim racing tries instead to capture the enthusiasts who simply just have a raw love of driving itself, it will likely find the market expanding exponentially. As a final addendum, it's fair to say that more work on the AI would be good in order to strengthen the single-player proposition. While the AI in ACC is perfectly serviceable, I do have a growing reel of dozens of occasions where cars have, seemingly unprompted, simply pit maneuvered and spun my car right off the track as if it didn't even exist. Ultimately, there's only so much AI can do, but at the very least it has to be raceable without actively attempting to sabotage the player. With that gargantuan wishlist and hypothesis reel out of the way, I just want to say that the announcement of a new sim racing title is always a great thing. It screams of potential and sets alight the passion we have for driving all over again. In what way will it exceed our favourite sims of today? Will we experience all new levels of connection and joy with the virtual driving experience? How many memorable races will we have with our friends and communities across the world? Oftentimes, the hope is better than the reality, but no matter what comes, it's sure to represent a step forward in sim racing, and that's always something worth celebrating. Make sure to subscribe for future sim racing news, monologues, and oversized Christmas wish lists. Until the next hype cycle, I'll see you all later.